Hi, good morning, everyone. Warm welcome to today's webinar on climate impacts, adaptation and vulnerability, implications for Fiji. My name is Prof Singh and I'm from the School of Science and Technology here at the University of Fiji. It is an absolute pleasure to be part of this webinar and to guide you through the program today. This webinar is being co-hosted by the University of Fiji and the Australian National University, and we are also truly grateful to be supported by our partners, the Fiji Meteorological Services, the Climate Change and International Cooperation Division at the Ministry of Economy, and the British High Commission in Suva. We'll be introducing our panelists from these organizations later in the program today. I hope that you will find today's session thought-provoking and informative. IPCC, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change Working Group 1 report, which is titled Climate Change 2021, the Physical Science Basis, is the first installment of the IPCC's 6th assessment report, which will be completed this year. The first report was released in August last year. And the second report, which is titled Impacts, Adaptation and Vulnerability, was released on Monday this week. And we are very fortunate to have Professor Mark Howden present these latest findings to us today. All right, so before we begin with our program proper, I would like to make a couple of announcements. First, please use the Q&A feature to ask questions. You can see a Q&A tab. That is the feature that we are going to use for questions today. So you'll be able to view all the submitted questions, and you can even upvote questions that you feel are most important to you. This will help us streamline the questions that most attendees want answers to. So please do not use the chat service to ask questions, because we'll be only responding to questions from the Q&A tab. Also note that this session is being recorded and it will be made publicly available to you on the ANU's Institute for Climate, Energy and Disaster Solutions website after the event. If there are any issues with these, please let Mehelani, the project officer, know as soon as possible. Our email addresses are on the chat as well. If you would like a copy of this recording to share, please also let Mehelani know and she will be able to provide you with one. We will also be uploading this presentation, this entire session on our University of Fiji website as well. We'll also share a link to the fact sheets towards the end of the program as well. All right, so without further ado, I will now introduce Professor Shahista Shamim, who is the Vice Chancellor and the Dean of Justice Devendra Pratik School of Law at the University of Fiji. Professor Shamim has worked in the area of human rights and environment since 2005, and she has been appointed as one of the 12 legal experts to assist the Commission of Small Island Developing States on climate change and international law. She's also currently working on ecocide as a method for upholding those responsible for destroying the environment to account in the international courts. With these words, I would now like to request Professor Shamim to deliver her opening remarks. Professor Shamim.
Thank you very much, Ms. Singh, for that introduction. And good morning to everyone. I know there are a number of participants from all over the world. The University of Fiji is really pleased and honored to be joining in this event with our IPCC colleagues from ANU, and I'm particularly anxious to hear Professor Mark Howden, who's the director of the ANU Institute for Climate, Energy and Disaster Solutions, and who is the vice chair of the IPCC. With respect to the work of the University of Fiji, we know that the science faculty have been involved in helping and in partnership with the IPCC to disseminate the information that is collected by various working groups, various agencies and individuals. And that is something that the University of Fiji is really proud to be associated with. And we have no better people than those who are in the faculty, and I see a lot of them have joined on today as well, who are experts in the field of environmental science, and also really working in the coalface of climate change issues and climate change crisis. Climate change issues have been a concern of Pacific Island states, as everyone knows, for a very long time. It's not a new thing. In fact, I recall in the 1970s when I was a student at the University of the South Pacific, one of the things we were really concerned about and protesting against was the testing on Mururo by the French, on Mururo Atoll, which was destroying the environment there. And while we were talking about it in those days as a nuclear issue, in fact, what really was of concern to all of us as well was the impact on the testing by the colonial powers on the small island states and the ecosystems of those places. So we've been working in this area for a very long time. But it is only over the past few years, I think since Fiji took over the presidency of the COP, I think it was COP 24 or 23. And of course, now we're in COP 26. So, and of course, it's disappointing what happened at COP 26 too, but I won't dwell on that just at the moment. But it was only since then that we realized the real impact of climate crisis on small island states. And of course, Fiji, even though it's not an atoll, or at least in most of the islands we have are high islands, nevertheless have suffered the effects of climate change and climate crisis in the kind of tides that we're experiencing, and the fact that the seawalls are being demolished as a result of waves that are coming with more and more frequency, and the harsher climate issues that we are facing, the floods and everything else that the whole world is suffering from at the moment. But when you've got a small island state or small islands that we have in the Pacific, the impact on that, not just on the ecosystem, but also on the people, seems to be much greater than the impact on the bigger countries. And that includes Australia and New Zealand, actually, in our region. So I'm really pleased that the University of Fiji is able to partner with IPCC on the series of events that's happening, and it seems to me that it's an ongoing project, and we will be very much involved through our science faculty to consider, the reports that are coming out of that whole process. Now, from what I can see, in the information that Ms. Singh has given me through the IPCC networks, is that, first of all, the most important thing obviously is about the assessment reports that have been issued, the special projects and the special reports, and just the assessment of what things are like. Now, quite often, I'm a lawyer by profession, so quite often we find that, a description is great, but unless you have some options for change or for mitigating the risks, then really it's just a list of things that's going wrong without necessarily saying what we're going to do to fix them. So from the legal side, of course, I'm very much interested in the scientific basis, because that's where the facts come from. That's where we lodge our submissions from. But also I'm interested in the litigation side, and that is not just about the diplomatic solution to climate change, which clearly COP26 showed that diplomacy is all very well, but at the last minute, two or three big powers come in and alter, the language to an extent where you find that it's disappointing for the people who are actually suffering the effects of climate change. And that is because of politics. So taking it away from the realm of politics into the realm of law is something that I'm very much involved in at the moment. So Ms. Singh had mentioned my work on eco-side. Now, we can take it away from description to we need the scientists for all of the analysis that has to be done. So obviously the IPCC work is really crucial to this work, to my work. And taking away from just pure description to, I noticed Dr. or Professor Howden is going to be talking about options. And that's really important for me, because what are the options? There's obviously the diplomacy options. There's obviously other options at political level that people might have, but there's also the legal options. And I think that the legal side has not been explored as much as it ought to have been so far. But I think some of the small island states are now feeling that we don't have any other option but the legal one. And that's where I come in, because I have experience in litigation, including at the international level. So one of the things that's really fascinating about the reports is that it provides the basis, the scientific basis for legal work that needs to be done. Now, the Commission of Small Island States has just been formed on climate change and international law. So it's Commission of Small Island States on Climate Change and International Law being the full title. And I'm one of the legal experts that's been appointed to look at this issue from the legal human rights perspective. And so when I did work in 2005, it was about the right to environment. And our partner at that stage was, because I was in the Human Rights Commission then, Fijian Human Rights Commission, and our partner at that stage was the government of Tuvalu. And the government of Tuvalu is still there, because the government of Tuvalu is probably one of the nations that's going to feel the effects of climate crisis on their people, their culture, and their environment more than others. So the step for the Commission of Small Island States on climate change and international law is to see how we can take the perpetrators who are causing climate change and climate crisis to court, to the international court, and which court. So there are a number of courts that obviously are the right venue for this, so the right forum for this. One of them is the International Court of Justice. Now, sometimes it's difficult to go to the International Court of Justice because you need, a whole lot of precedents, and you need a whole lot of arrangements to be put in place before you can actually take something to the International Court of Justice. The International Criminal Court is an interesting one that we're exploring at the moment, because the word ecocide has come up more and more in the language of many lawyers, many international lawyers, who are saying, well, it's time to stop talking and it's time to start acting. And acting for lawyers means litigation or an application to the court. So it could be any of the courts, that we would go to. But the one that we're looking at right now is the International Criminal Court on the basis of ecocide, like genocide, but ecocide. So the Rome Statute, which is what set up the International Criminal Court, is the one that one has to look at to see whether, in fact, either individuals or corporations can also be held to account for climate crisis. So that's my work at the moment, and I'm particularly interested in seeing how the work of the IPCC may inform the legal process or the litigation process in international law that I'll be involved in. So I'm very interested in the proceedings this morning. Thank you so much, Ms. Singh.
Thank you, Professor Shamim. Indeed, climate change is requires a truly interdisciplinary approach to solve so many different issues that we are facing currently, especially the small island developing nations. And I'm so glad that you're part of this legal experts on the Commission for Small Island Developing States, because legal aspects are one of the things that we have not really covered in detail when it comes to solving climate change issues. So I'm so glad that we would be, working together in future as an interdisciplinary team when it comes to solving climate change issues for us in the Pacific. So thank you so much, Professor Shamim. I would now like to introduce our keynote speaker for today, Professor Mark Howden. He is the Director and Head of Climate Change at the Australian National University Institute for Climate, Energy and Disaster Solutions. He's also an honorary professor at Melbourne University, a vice-chair of the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, and is the chair of the ACT Climate Change Council. He was on the US Federal Advisory Committee for the 3rd National Climate Assessment, was a member of the Australian National Climate Science Advisory Committee, and contributes to several major national and international science and policy advisory bodies. He has been a major contributor to the IPCC since 1991, with roles in the 2nd, 3rd, 4th, 5th, and now 6th assessment reports, sharing the 2007 Nobel Peace Prize with other IPCC participants an hour ago. So I would like to now invite Professor Mark Howden to deliver his presentation. Over to you, Professor Mark.
Bula, everyone. Thank you very much, Priya, for that. And also thanks for Shasta for the introductory comments. They were really very spot on. And before I start, I'd actually just like to acknowledge the traditional owners on the lands on who I stand today. That's the Ngunnawal people, and pay my respects to their elders past and present. And also I'd like to acknowledge Mahalani Delaney, who's the co-author on this presentation. And just down the bottom of the slide that you will see in a second is hopefully that's showing up. Priya, there's a full screen.
That's great.
Yes.
Yep. Yeah, and so just down the bottom of this slide is a series of fact sheets that Mahalani and we've prepared on these topics associated with climate change in the Pacific. So they cover different topics, and there's an overview fact sheet. So they're quite easy to assess, I think, is the intention. And so I'll just move on to the sort of the key part of the presentation, but at the start, just noting that as Priya mentioned, this is part of a long series of reports within the IPCC sixth assessment cycle. We had at the start of the cycle, the first report was the 1.5 degrees report, followed by the land report, land and climate change, the ocean and cryosphere report. In between, there was some work on emission inventories. Last August, there was the climate change report, which we worked with University of Fiji in a presentation similar to this. And now we have the second working group dealing with adaptation and impacts side of things. And in about a month from now, we've got the next report, which is the emission reduction report, the mitigation report, followed later this year by the synthesis report. And that's the full cycle of the IPCC. So this is one of many components to that cycle. Now, if we look at the report which came out the other day, it's a really big report, like 3,600 pages of very dense text. Writing that was 270 authors from 67 countries. 43% were of those authors from developing countries, 57% from developed, 41% women, the remainder men. And then there was a whole series of other authors who wrote small pieces of text, so over 600 of them. The report references more than 34,000 scientific papers, and in the preparation of the report, the authors had to respond to over 62,000 separate review comments, each of which had to be dealt with individually. And because this is not just a report by the science community, but it's effectively a report which is scoped and approved and agreed by the governments of the world, it actually is a joint activity between the science community and the policy communities. And through that process, I think it's fair to say that this report gives us our best understanding yet to date in terms of climate impacts, adaptation and vulnerability. Now, of course, this is a global report, which only has limited information on any specific nation. And so what we've done, and Mahalani particularly, is look through a report for particular aspects of this that relate to what may be happening and what might happen in the future to Fiji. And so what we're doing here is a very small subsection of a very big report, and it's a very very quick overview of incredibly deep content here. So this is to some extent just an introduction to this big report. So one of the key things that comes out in this report is that there's already significant changes in terms of climate stresses and particularly extreme events being felt right around the world. So right here in Australia at the moment, we're suffering record flood events across parts of the East Coast, around Brisbane and Gold Coast and northern New South Wales. And it wasn't that long ago that we had massive fires here in many parts of the world and massive heat waves in many parts of the world. And so these extreme events are just becoming more common and more severe. And when we look at Fiji and other island nations around the Pacific, you're already being affected by slow onset stresses as well as extreme events. So the slow onset stresses include long-term increases in air temperature. So across the globe, we've experienced around about 1.1 degrees on average increase above the pre-industrial levels in terms of temperature. We've seen changes in rainfall patterns. So the rain is falling in slightly different times and in different amounts, often much heavier rainfall than we used to get. We've seen increases in ocean temperature. So as the world warms up, a lot of the energy is actually absorbed by the oceans. It's captured at the surface and then buried down deep. And so it accumulates deep down in the ocean. And as that temperature accumulates in the ocean, the water expands. So when you heat water, it expands. And so we see a sea level rise from that, as well as sea level rise from the breakdown of the ice sheets in Greenland and in West Antarctica, the breakdown of glaciers in many parts of the world, and also groundwater pumping. So when we pump groundwater from under the ground and put it up onto, say, crops, that evaporates, and a big part of that ends up in the ocean. So we see sea level rise going up significantly. So last year was around about 4.5 millimetres of sea level rise across the globe. Some places have more sea level rise than others, but that's going up, accelerating over time. So it's going up faster and faster over time. Now, as our oceans absorb carbon dioxide, they also get slightly more acidic. So they get less alkaline because of that carbon dioxide they're absorbing from all of the emissions that we're making across the globe. And so we're seeing changes in the chemistry of our oceans as well as the temperature of our oceans. And there's also changes, particularly in the Pacific, in the oxygen levels. So as the oceans warm and they get more rainfall, because warmer worlds on average rain more, it increases the layer of fresh water on top of the oceans, and the oxygen gets depleted in that freshwater layer. And so we're seeing deoxygenation of the oceans with reductions in productivity as a result. We also see changes in extreme events. That's the list down the right-hand side of this picture. So we're seeing, as a proportion of the cyclones that occur, we're seeing more of the category 3, 4, and 5 cyclones across the world. And within each of those categories, the average wind speed is going up. So wind speed is the big damaging factor with cyclones, as well as rainfall in some circumstances. But wind speed, the damage associated with wind speed is actually the cube of wind speed. So it's wind speed times wind speed times wind speed is proportional to the damage you experience. So strong cyclones, as you experience with Cyclone Winston, can cause immense damage, which takes a long time and are very expensive to fix. In parts of the Pacific, we're also seeing increased storm surges and future risk from storm surge. So when a cyclone hits the coast, it not only pushes water in front of it, which in some circumstances can pile the water up against the land. Underneath the cyclone, the water level is elevated because of the low pressure in the cyclone. And so you get what's called a storm surge. And oftentimes they're in the 1 or 2 meters sort of range. So it's like a slow moving tsunami, but in extreme circumstances, it can be several meters. We're also seeing droughts and extreme rainfall happening more frequently. So our variability of our rainfall is increasing, and we're getting those droughts more frequently and extreme rainfall more frequently, because as the atmosphere warms, it can hold exponentially more water. And the El Nino-La Nina cycle tends to be becoming more intense. So we're getting more extremes on either end, but not necessarily more frequent. And we're also seeing more frequent and severe heat waves as a result of the temperature increases. So we're seeing lots of change right across the globe. And one of the big ones, of course, for the Pacific is what happens to sea level rise. So this is a graph from the previous IPCC report, the Working Group 1 report, which shows different scenarios of sea level rise under different greenhouse gas emission scenarios. So these are the coloured lines in the middle of the graph, and they're associated with different emission scenarios, ranging from the very low emission scenario to the very high. So a very low emission scenario is essentially consistent with keeping to 1.5 degrees, a low emission scenario is essentially consistent with keeping to 2 degrees, but at the moment we're basically heading on the intermediate or maybe slightly above the intermediate scenario. And we can see that those have very different sea level rise consequences as we go to the end of the century. A low emission scenario, about 0.5 metre, a high emission scenario close to 1 metre. But in all of these cases with those coloured lines, is that those models, which they're based on, don't necessarily include all of the processes we're starting to observe. So things like ice cliff instability and rapid breakdown processes of things like the Greenland ice sheet. So when we look at how to include those through expert elicitation, we get to that dotted line in the middle of the graph, which goes up. And that indicates that we could have much bigger sea level rise by the end of the century than the models would indicate. So even up to 1.75 metres by the end of the century. And that report could not rule out increases in sea level rise of up to 5 metres by year 2150. That's halfway through the next century, which is truly a terrifying prospect. So that sea level rise that we've already seen is impacting on coastlines around the Pacific, as you well know. And what this particular graph shows is the percentage of different island nations' population which may be exposed to coastal inundation. So that might be permanently exposed or temporarily exposed. And we see across many different island groups, the majority of people being exposed to inundation, around the coastlines of those islands. Fiji to a lesser extent, that's the circle around Fiji. So, but nevertheless, significant potential impacts in relation to Fiji. If we look at impacts on food production, so they're generally speaking negative across the Pacific and including in Fiji. So not too many studies on this in Fiji. So one of them indicates more dependence on imported food because local food accessibility may be reduced. And another set of studies looks at things like sugar cane yields, which look like they're going to be depressed under higher climate change. And this is consistent with those scenarios elsewhere for sugar across the tropics. And of course, sugar is a significant part of Fiji's exports. So potentially exports are threatened on the land as well as exports from your ocean resources. Now, a big one, of course, is what happens to coral reefs and fisheries across the Pacific. And if we look at the left-hand panel that's on the screen, that looks at the changes in the ocean factors, such as coral bleaching, so where the temperature goes up and it causes bleaching of our corals. What might happen to coral reef structure and erosion of that, including through acidification. Storm damage. As temperatures go up, we get more energetic waves causing more storm damage. And in terms of fisheries, we're already starting to see species migrations, so species moving further south, following the cooler water and following the food. Higher carbon dioxide levels are acidifying the water, making it less alkaline, and that's already eroding the shells of some organisms in our oceans. And we're seeing impacts on population characteristics of fish species, so including size reductions and lower growth potential. Now, all of these things associated with climate change impact on other human impacts, so other things we're doing to the ocean and our coasts. So amongst of those, we get things like algae growing, sort of green slime growing over coral because of increased nutrient content next to, say, sugarcane lands, where you get nitrogen being added to the oceans. Sometimes destructive fishery practices, sometimes sedimentation from our rivers going out to our coral reefs and smothering them. Sometimes we've got overfishing and sometimes coastal development with pollution and other factors coming into it. And so there's a whole series of resulting consequences of that, which include loss of habitat for our species, reduced fishing yields, loss of coastal protection, so the buffering elements that coral reefs and vegetation on our coastline provides our coasts, ecological disruption, higher operational costs in various ways, including for infrastructure associated with the coast, fisheries changes, and impacts on our tourism. So clearly, dead coral reefs are not as attractive as vibrant and live ones. And these pictures show the sort of difference between a healthy reef and one which is impacted heavily by coral bleaching. On the left-hand side is a healthy reef, particularly those reefs that we used to see, but there's still healthy reefs around the world. In the middle is one which is marginally depleted, and on the right-hand side is one which is significantly degraded. And you can see how the difference in attractiveness for, say, tourism is between those different circumstances. And so we are very concerned about coral reefs. Now, this particular graph shows how coral reef sort of condition, like the percentage of healthy reefs, can change under different climate scenarios. So if we focus on the left-hand panel, what this shows is percentage of coral reefs which were assessed as being healthy back in 1950, so essentially 100%, and how that's declined already up to the present, and how that may change with different emission trajectories in the future. So the B labelled trajectory is with a very low emissions pathway, consistent with 2 degrees, and the other trajectories are for higher emissions pathways. So this is assuming that there's no autonomous adaptation, so no evolution of the symbiosis between the corals and the zooxanthellae, between the animals and the plants that make up a coral organism. And the picture on the right-hand side is what this model shows is if there is evolution of that symbiosis, either through natural processes or through accelerated processes, through such as laboratory experiments where we experiment with different combinations of zooxanthellae and corals and try to repopulate reefs with more heat-resistant organisms. And you can see that that adaptation significantly changes the trajectories of coral damage or coral health, depending on how you look at it. And the colours in each of those trajectories indicates the temperature. And we can see that as temperature goes up, health of reefs goes down. Now, what might happen in terms of broader marine productivity? These are changes, possible changes in broader marine productivity going towards the end of the century compared with what we've experienced more recently. And we can see that on the left-hand side, if we go down a low emission scenario, things change across the Pacific, including around Fiji. And in fact, around Fiji, there may actually be some increases in productivity as an animal biomass, as species move further south, as productive zones move further south. But once we get to a high emission scenario, it's looking pretty bad across most of the Pacific. But again, possible increases in productivity towards the east of Fiji. Now, the next part of the talk is adaptation options, and there's a huge amount covered in this report on adaptation options. But when we summarise it, it's very clear that there is more and more action happening on climate adaptation, and that's being documented reasonably well. But clearly, the progress on adaptation is both uneven, so it's not evenly spread, and overall, we're not adapting fast enough to keep pace with the rates of climate change that we're seeing. And again, there's a huge amount of depth in this report, and I suggest you read as a start the summary for policymakers to look at the types of adaptation strategies and the enabling factors for adaptation that might help accelerate adaptation to get a feel for this. But just one example of adaptation options, which may be relevant in your situation, is if we look at what might happen to coastal infrastructure under different adaptation responses to sea level rise and increased wave energy. So very clearly, that's a significant risk associated with climate change, that we may see both the sea level rise and the increased wave energy leading to erosion and flooding and storm surge risk. And so the first panel here just indicates what happens if we've got our existing infrastructure and we get that combination of sea level rise and wave energy coming higher. The first panel underneath it is what happens if we actually institute ecosystem-based measures, such as planting mangroves around our coasts to absorb some of that wave energy so it's no longer as damaging. And we see potentially reductions in damage associated with that. But of course, not everywhere is suited to doing those sort of soft adaptation measures. And in some places, we put in hard adaptation measures. So that's the panel on the top right, where we build something like a seawall or a levee to stop the waves getting in. And that can be for low levels of sea level rise, and as long as the wave energy and cyclones don't increase too much in strength, that can be a viable proposition in some circumstances. But it is very expensive and often very greenhouse gas intensive. And when you get water overtopping, coming over those hard protection systems or breaking them down, then you can get very large amounts of damage because the infrastructure behind them is not adapted to those circumstances, to being flooded and having storm waves bashing against them. So one of the other ways you can adapt is do what we call is accommodation. So you can do things like raise your buildings on stilts, so they're elevated above the ground, and so they're above the water level, and so they're safe. And in some circumstances, that can be a very effective response as well. And the last response down the bottom right is what we call a planned relocation option, and where you actually progressively move your infrastructure, your houses and your roads and similar things, your schools, up the slope away from the water. And in Fiji, you're actually some of the world leaders in this, in terms of very constructively getting people to do this move in a very constructive and consistent way. Now, there's different timescales for different options, adaptation options. So, and that's briefly what this graph shows, is that there's some adaptation options that you could implement now, and they have effectiveness for a period, maybe a couple of decades. So things like ecosystem-based adaptation and removal of sediment or addition of sediment, beach nourishment type activities. There's other structured adaptation options like elevating houses, which you could start doing now, but which will be particularly useful, maybe a decade from now up to halfway through the century. But then there's other options, which is like putting in very hard barriers and planned relocation, which probably will only accelerate some decades from now, but will be very long-term in their nature and how persistent they are. And so this just graph sort of indicates that there's different options you can consider at different times, and they have different longevity in terms of helping manage climate change. Now, sitting in amongst this report, there's many different tables, such as this sort of table. What this does is it shows different solutions, in this case to coastal erosion and sea level rise. And so there's different solutions down the left-hand side. The sort of blue colours sitting in there are different feasibility levels. So the light colours are not very feasible. The darker colours are much more feasible. The number of dots indicates, in this case, the confidence in how feasible they are. So in the case of early warning systems, we're pretty confident we can put those in place. So they're highly feasible. The orangey colours indicate different levels of effectiveness. So some of these adaptation options are more effective than others. And then there's an assessment of which different sectors these solutions really apply to. So for example, the accommodation and relocation option is assessed as working for coastal settlements and their sustainability, for maritime transport, for if you have a port, it helps that, and for health outcomes, but not necessarily so much for tourism or fisheries and mariculture. That's aquaculture. And so across these different options, there's assessments of how viable they may be and which ones you might want to think about first. And of course, there's a whole series of enabling factors that need to be put in place that allow these different adaptations to happen. So institutional factors, have you got the institutional frameworks and support to do this? Governance, including the legal aspects that were mentioned by Shasta, and finance aspects, knowledge aspects, which are about how to do some of these things effectively. And the list goes on. So there's quite a significant coverage of this in the Working Group 2 report. And the last slide or so is what might be some of those keys to success in adaptation over and above those institutions and governance and knowledge sort of elements, which I just mentioned. And a key one that pops up time and time again is that being inclusive in decision-making processes is actually really important. Inclusiveness not only gets people to own the solutions, so they're more likely to adopt them, but it also brings different types of knowledge into developing those solutions and identifying what the problems are. And so broadly across the report, there's an acknowledgement that participatory inclusion of different voices across different parts of society is actually really important for getting positive adaptation outcomes. And this really reflects, I think, the fact that all of us can be affected by climate change. And so all of us need to be involved in the solutions to climate change. And so just to wrap this up, one of the key things that we brought out in this report was what we need to have is those solutions associated with climate adaptation linked in to those solutions related to emission reduction, so that's reducing greenhouse gas emissions across the globe, and linking both of those into sustainable development and sustainable development pathways. And that's what we call climate resilient development. And if we look across the globe, climate resilient development, sort of ticking all of those boxes off, is already a challenge at current global warming levels. And this report suggests that the prospects for effective climate resilient development become further limited if warming exceeds 1.5 degrees, and may not be possible if warming exceeds 2 degrees. So our window of options narrows the more temperature goes up, and the effectiveness of those options decreases the more temperature goes up. So amongst all of the arguments that Pacific Island nations have put up in terms of why climate change is crucial to your future, I think there's additional arguments in this report that can be brought to bear as to why we should act with urgency and act very effectively and act in a very socially just and equitable way. And I'd just like to leave that there, and thanks again everyone for listening, and thanks to the University of Fiji for this opportunity.
Thank you, Professor Mark, for your very informative presentation. Indeed, we've heard so much about the climate change impacts in Fiji and the Pacific, but your presentation today highlighted some of the key adaptation options that we should be focusing on. And I think most of us, even here at the University of Fiji, are already looking into some of these adaptation options that you have mentioned, and we are also conducting studies, including communities as well, because I think the coastal communities are the ones who are going to be greatly impacted, and so we're now including them in our research because their voices matter a lot. So thank you very much, Professor Mark Howden, for that very informative presentation. All right, everyone. So we are now moving towards the next part of the program, which is a panel discussion that will be facilitated by Dr. Ramendra Prasad, Senior Lecturer in Physics and the Head of the Department of Science at the University of Fiji. So he will be introducing all the panelists, and after we have had from the panelists, then we will move into the Q&A section today. So just a reminder to all the attendees, if you have any questions, please feel free to type it in the Q&A box, and we will attend to it after the panelists have provided their introductions. So, all right, and over to you now, Dr. Raman.
Thank you, Priya. So in this panel discussion, we will have the introduction of our panelists. We have 4 panelists, and then after that, we will move on to the Q&A session. Please keep your questions coming through to through the Q&A feature that we have in the Zoom. So you can also upvote the questions that you like and keep the questions there. And then after the introduction of the panelists, we will move on to our Q&A session. So our first panelist is Mr. Kushal Raj. He is the officer in charge of climate change at the Ministry of Economy. I would like to invite Kushal Raj to deliver his talk.
Thank you, Dr. Ramendra. I'm just trying to do a screen share quickly before we go on to the presentation.
Have you managed to do that?
No, I think it's okay. Basically, I can speak without the presentation, which maybe I can share later on if that's
Perhaps,
okay
yeah.
with everyone. Yeah, but with regards to the presentation today, and I must really thank Professor Mark for covering the key aspects of the IPCC report on climate impacts, adaptation, and vulnerability. And of course, this is one of the key adaptation reports after 2014, and which means that it covers a great impact in terms of the adaptation sector since the last report. So yeah, really, in the sense of policy, because that's really where the climate change and international cooperation division for Fiji comes in. This becomes as a very important baseline report, not only when we look at policy mapping and key stakeholder mapping and undertaking some of the collaboration and partnerships that we do with regards to climate change, project implementation, but really when it comes to the international arena, when we go for negotiations at COP, to be able to justify some of the literature and support our evidence and reporting the negotiation process. So really thank the contribution for all these authors, and of course Fiji welcomes the 2022 IPCC report on the impacts and adaptation and vulnerability, and with regards to some of the key interventions it has on adaptation. Now, what you'll see in the report, and I will not deep dive much on that because Professor Mark has really covered, the A to Z of this, but, there are a lot of impacts it has on island morphology, including ecosystems and natural resources, the livelihoods and, the impact, climate change has on infrastructure. Like I mentioned, a lot of analysis and, gap analysis has been done in this report that looks at, not only inundation, intrusion of salt water, the impact it has on livelihoods with regards to fisheries, with regards to, some of the markets and economies, the ocean drives, for example, but really the huge impacts, we've had on infrastructure, right from increasing intensity of cyclones that we have to the rapid and onset of climatic events. So you'll see that, the impacts have been multifold, not only in parts of Fiji, but across the world, with increasing drought frequency in, natural disasters and the damages that we have on our ocean. And so knowing that, and of course, these impacts on climate change are not new, but what we have seen is that it has only increased its intensity, and which means we as vulnerable countries have, increased our vulnerability. While when you look at, the commitments on climate finance and the commitment on resourcing, it has really not moved much, so the future itself is a predicament, and this report sort of, brings about, the realization of these processes. In addition, I would like to break this down further into ocean finance and adaptation, some of the large streams of work that we do also in the climate change division. On oceans, the increasing temperature, of course, has had, various impacts in Fiji. For that case, PCIDs, we are largely dependent on tourism, and marine eco-based tourism is a large market driver for our economies. And, with increasing not only sea level rise, but increasing ocean temperatures, ocean acidification, deoxygenation, and the whole plethora of impacts, the climate change has on ocean ecosystems, really it's putting the pressure that we have on marine ecotourism and sort of the benefits that we get out of this ecosystem. In addition, while as resilient as our reefs are in the Pacific and in Fiji, really, the increasing temperatures will put a lot of pressure on our coral reefs to be able to be resilient. So we need to look at a lot of adaptation interventions. Some already, discussed previously in the presentation by Professor Mark. And of course, maintaining these from events such as coral bleaching. What are some of the ways by which Fiji and the world can adapt to, our coral reef ecosystems being able to thrive in conditions as such, noting that a lot of biodiversity sits within these areas. And of course, in the next, 50 to 100 years, if the trend continues, and so it is, we lose all this biodiversity impact. So Fiji has been, very vocal on the CBD, and we wish to, further continue some of these interventions, looking at, the losses that we have in our ecosystem. In addition, of course, we are seeing, a plethora of issues on the ocean ecosystem, like I've mentioned, bleaching, acidification, deoxygenation. As economies reliant on our ocean and the blue economy sector, for Fiji, it sort of, just increases the vulnerability we have. And thus we need to ensure that, the right adaptive measures need to be intervened. And I'm glad that the previous presentation covered some of these aspects. What we are working, at least at the national level, is to look at, coral reef insurance programming, to look at, UN developed fund that is able to ensure that there is systematic finance and sustainable financing to ensure our reefs are protected. And of course, this works in line with our 30% marine protected areas target. In addition, there's a whole new focus in this year's budget with regards to blue recovery, looking at, blue bond initiatives in the aquaculture, in the shipping industry, and, marine protected areas. So these sort of interventions at the national level are sort of helping us prepare, to adapt to some of these, increasing difficulties on our marine ecosystems. And of course, as you know, that we are a low-lying Pacific Island countries, just like the PCID. So, while there is whole of these impacts on biodiversity, on our losses, to coral reefs, to the marine ecotourism, but we bit more about sea level rise and adaptation, after finance. But really what is key here is, we keep continuing to say is, the need for accessible climate finance. While climate finance, obviously, since AR5 has been shown to have been a bit rapidly increasing, but really, these global, financial flows are insufficient, for the constraints we have on implementation of adaptation options, especially for Fiji and other developing countries. And obviously the discussions in the climate finance arena will tell you that most of these go to mitigation, when really, Fiji is interested in adaptation because we contribute almost nil to the whole global climate change scenario. We'd like to, of course, case study mitigation, but really it's, looking at impactful adaptation finance that is able to look at resilience, and the new report keeps on, to development. And of course, with regards to, climate finance, while we've had a, successful outcome at COP26, really the 100 billion, commitment has not been coming forward. We need to increase and double adaptation finance, as well as see dedication to loss and damage. The report keeps mentioning that, loss and damage, is going to make vulnerable countries like us much more vulnerable, because we're not able to provide adequate resources into, climate resilience. So these are really some of the international discussions, and the need for the right amount, the right climate finance to flow in to be able to adapt to the atrocities that we face. And the report also mentions that investment now is far cheaper than the future, and we all know that case. Being able to be resilient now is going to be at a much more lower cost than being so in the future. So we cannot delay negotiations. We cannot delay these commitments. It has to be immediate. And really what we want to see at COP27 moving to Egypt is that, loss and damage and the new, collective government finance is able to progress quickly, and that we have commitments flowing in to be able to, not only look at the ongoing issues on financing, but really, to build up from the IPCC report, which is, credible information, which is credible, news to the greater world in terms of what's really happening in terms of impact. And really, instead of this putting, difficulties onto our national economic growth and planning, because Fiji having to, mobilize these climate, finances for its adaptation really impacts the sort of work that we do in our economies to be able to become more resilient, given the whole COVID-19 situation now. So instead of burdening our own economy, really, the due diligence has to be done by the developed countries that need to put in these additional finances. And, even with us relaxing, or Fiji rather relaxing its
Thank you, Mr. Raj.
Yeah.
Thank you very much. I would have to stop you because we are pressed for time right now, and we have other panelists and we have the Q&A sessions. Sincere apologies for that, but we will hear from you more during our Q&A sessions. Thank you, Mr. Raj. Now we will move on to our next panelist, who is Mr. Kunal Singh. Mr. Singh is the Climate Policy Officer at the British High Commission, SUVA. He provides climate policy support and direction to the Pacific Island countries and supports bilateral engagements for the UK COP26 presidency in the region. Kunal has a master's and bachelor's in environmental science from the University of the South Pacific. Prior to joining the High Commission, Kunal was a teaching assistant at the School of Geography, Earth Sciences and Environment at USP from 2017 to 2020. Kunal is also an active researcher in climate and environment changes, climate finance, and climate politics. So we will have Mr. Singh to deliver his small talk.
Thank you, Ramendra, and I hope you can hear me. Yeah, thank you. So thank you to Professor Mark Howden and Kushal for the interventions. I think this was really helpful. So where I come in, basically, as Ramendra, as the moderator has said, is in my role as a climate policy officer here at the High Commission in SUVA, and basically as our current role as the COP26 presidency. So what we do basically is provide support and opportunities for Fiji, but also for the region, the 14 PCIDs in the South Pacific, to amplify their voices on the global arena. So I think, as the other speakers have said, basically, the IPCC report on climate change, the second working group report, makes it very clear that action to adapt and prevent climate change cannot wait. We all know that. And the Stark report, released a few days ago, is a reminder to the world about how climate change is affecting our planet, underlining that we need to move further and faster to adapt, embracing the commitments that was agreed at Glasgow last year in COP26, mostly outlining the Glasgow Climate Pact that we all must have gone through. The IPCC second report also says that global action on a changing climate needs to be kept within that 1.5 degree target that we all talk about. And which requires countries to visit their NDCs, the national determined contributions, and strengthen them ahead of 2030 and reaching net zero by 2050. The UK agrees with the UK COP26 presidency agrees with the IPCC that global action to adapt to the changing climate has not been sufficient. As well as reducing our emissions, we know and we need to work together with each other to support and better invest and adapt to rising temperatures in the years ahead, building on the principles agreed to in the Glasgow Climate Pact. At Glasgow in December last year, there were notable progresses on adaptation, loss and damage, and some of that Kushal was able to touch on. There was an immediate launch of the Glasgow Sharm el-Sheikh work program to deliver on global goal of adaptation, with developed countries agreeing to double their adaptation finance and climate finance by 2025. I think on the climate goal, on the climate finance goal, yes, we were not able to reach the 100 billion target that was reached, but I think there was substantial progress on agreements that were made. So I think that's some good progress that was made in climate finance. Access to climate finance still remains an area that we need to work on. I agree with that. On loss and damage, I think we failed to deliver a dedicated facility for the region, and that's one of the disappointments that the PCIDs have. But I think there was major achievements on having recognized loss and damage as one of the factors that needs to be really focused on, especially for the vulnerable countries like the PCIDs. The impacts of a rapidly changing climate in Fiji and the Pacific is not only felt as a climate crisis, and as you all know, but also as a humanitarian crisis and a socioeconomic crisis. At COP26 last year, the Pacific message to the big emitters was quite loud and clear to act now. As the COP26 presidency, I think we take the Pacific as one of our biggest allies to work with climate change and push the big emitters, the G7s, the G20s, for progressive action on climate finance, mitigation, and adaptation. Last week, just a few days ago, I think we held a huge event in Suva here, which was a hybrid event, where we invited the Pacific governments, negotiators, crop agencies, private sector, civil society organizations, just to provide them a platform to unpack on Pacific's priorities and also the outcomes that we have achieved in COP26. So also, I think this was also an opportunity for people who were not able to travel to Glasgow, mainly because of COVID restrictions in the region, to talk directly to COP President Alok Sharma and the regional COP Ambassador Ken O'Flaherty, who was here in Fiji for a week. So I think this gave the region a good opportunity to talk about things that we were not able to discuss. We had about, I think, 300 participants joined from all over the region, so which was really good. And some of the priorities that were organized, I think, is really quite similar to what we have been knowing for quite some time on climate finance, loss and damage, oceans, gender equality, and these were also highlighted. Just to advance on regional priorities, I think the UK COP26 presidency is working quite closely with Fiji and the other Pacific Island countries on the task force on access to climate finance. Like Kushal mentioned, access is the major problem. So what the task force is doing is trying to leverage the private sector and public sector finance to improve the access, and also getting philanthropic investments in the region to increase access on climate finance. On oceans, we already have a huge number of programs going on in the region. The Blue Planet Fund is an ongoing program. And then we have incoming programs like CARA, which is the Climate Action for Resilient Asia and Pacific. We have the Seas Adaptation and Resilience Program, the CEDA, that is coming up. So these programs will look into increasing the climate resilience and supporting capacity building in the region. And I think the Blue Planet Fund is one example of what the Blue Planet Fund is doing with Fiji currently. We also share quite a good relationship with the One Crop, that's PrEP, SPC, PIPS, and we continue to work together with them in the region to amplify the Pacific voices ahead of COP27 in Sharm el-Sheikh in Egypt. In the lead up to COP27, as the UK presidency, we are keen to work together with Egypt to help maintain progress on SIDS issues and ensure that our Egyptian colleagues appreciate the value of Pacific SIDS to help deliver progressive outcomes in Sharm el-Sheikh. In conclusion, I think I've taken quite a bit of time, but thank you, Ramendra, for holding up. In conclusion, I think the IPCC Working Group 1 and 2 meetings are highly influential globally to drive ambition, including providing evidence that helps us to deliver many key outcomes in Glasgow. Therefore, the report is likely to be critical in driving progress in the future and also during our presidency year as we look ahead to implementing most of our commitments. Thank you so much, and thank you to all the speakers.
Thank you, Mr. Singh, for your talk on the climate policy perspective. Now we will move on to our third panelist, who is Ms. Arieta Daphne. She is a senior scientific officer at the Fiji Meteorological Services, and Fiji Met Services is also the IPCC national focal point. So can we have Ms. Daphne deliver her small talk?
Thank you, moderator. Firstly, I'd like to thank Madam DC for the very enlightening speech. And thank you, Professor Mark, for the very informative and well-presented presentation, especially when you have actually narrowed it down to the impacts that are likely to be affected, to affect Fiji. So as the moderator has said, for Fiji, we are the IPCC focal point is currently with the Fiji Met Service. And at the moment, it's our acting director, Mr. Terry Atali, for whom unfortunately could not be here for this event due to some urgent commitments in so far. And for us at the Fiji Met Service, what we do is we link the government, the Fiji government, to the national scientific community with reference to IPCC. So for instance, before there is a call for for the next assessment cycle, when there is invitations for others for these IPCC reports, what we do, we also send out invitations to these academic institutions, calling for interested authors or nomination for others for these IPCC reports. And one of the issue I'd like to raise is that we would like to encourage more scientific research to be held or to be conducted with reference to the Pacific. And our story in the Pacific cannot be well communicated unless it is coming from us. So for all these IPCC reports and contributions that have been going on, there is very little or very few papers that have been published with reference to the Pacific. Fiji Met Service and other national scientific communities have also been involved in the evaluation or the review of papers. For us, it's especially for the working group 1 paper that deals with the physical science. We do participate in the review of this working group 1 paper. And lastly, I would like to encourage our scientific communities, our young scientists, to please continue to do research, especially for our Pacific Island. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Daphne, and appreciate it. I mean, we are lacking a lot of research here in the Pacific, and we have a question on that as well, so we will discuss that. And our 4th panelist is Professor Mark Howden himself. We have heard from him, so there is no need for introduction. I will just briefly tell you about the 4 panelists again. We have Mr. Kushal Raj from the Ministry of Economy. We have Mr. Kunal Singh from the British High Commission, and we have Ms. Arietta Daphne from Fiji Met Services, and the 4th panelist is Professor Mark Howden. Now I will move on to the questions that we have in our Q&A platform. If you have not asked any questions, you can do so, and we will select the questions according to how they have been voted. So the first question that I have is from Professor Kumar, and he has also highlighted about the lack of scientific literature from the Pacific. So I would pose this question to Professor Mark Howden. He mentioned that there is usually lack of literature from the Pacific, and there is more literature from the Caribbean when you are preparing this IPCC report. So how was the balance in literature achieved from all these small island developing states?
Thanks, Ramendra, and thanks, Hendra, for that question. So when the authors are looking at the literature, they would have been looking for everything they could get. And then from that big pool of literature, selecting the material that comes into the report. And I think there's a general consensus that the Pacific is not as rich in terms of the scientific literature on climate change, impacts, adaptation, vulnerability, resilience, emission reduction as other regions. And so that request from Arietta for people in the Pacific to do the research, publish the research, ensure that there's information out in the scientific literature that tells the story about the Pacific and that demonstrates what's going on in the Pacific and the adaptation options that are particularly relevant and able to be implemented in the Pacific is really important. And so I think this is a wake-up call for much more activity in the research institutions across the Pacific to actually get material out there that can be used by the IPCC. Because if there is good material there, the IPCC and similar reports will pick that up. But if there isn't good material, if there aren't scientific publications there, they simply can't do that. I should actually emphasize that one of the Pacific Island authors, Morgan Wairu, who had a very significant role in the IPCC Working Group 2 report. Morgan was previously at Fiji and has now moved back to the Solomons, I think it is. And so Morgan's clearly there to ensure that the material that is available in the Pacific is actually represented in that report. So I think there is a challenge there for people in the Pacific, but I think it's one that you can rise to and meet.
Thank you, Professor Howden, for that answer. So yes, we need more research, more literature from the Pacific as well, which can be cited properly in the IPCC reports. The next question, which is here is posed towards Mr. Kushal Raj, and Professor Kumar is again asking about the finances, which is again a barrier in Fiji and other developing countries. So perhaps Mr. Raj could highlight some of the what do you call projects that is ongoing, and some of the things that Fiji is trying to do in terms of adaptation in Fiji. Mr. Raj?
Thank you, Dr. Ramin, and thank you, Dr. Mahan. Indeed, and I have a very short limited time. I have to go for another meeting now. But what I wanted to raise here is that Fiji has, cabinet endorsed its national climate finance strategy. So what it has is a list of all its mitigation and adaptation and ocean, project pipelines that we want to basically invest in the future. These are, of course, consulted. They are in line to our NDC commitment and have been also featured from Fiji's approved national NDC investment plan. And you see a lot of interventions starting from nature-based solutions to ecosystems-based management plans to be able to look at, interventions in adaptation and what are some of, and outcomes, of course, from the in-situ intervention we are doing with regards to alternatives to relocation. So the national, climate finance strategy has these interventions listed. We are yet to put this out publicly, but we'll be able to share in the due time. And my apologies for also leaving the session. I have another meeting at this time, but happy to also follow up with Priya and the team on other discussions. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Raj, for your time. Now we will move on to another question, which is from Shivani. So what she is asking is it's an open question to all the panelists. To share your experiences or opinions on hands-on and simple yet effective approaches that can be used by the communities out there in order to adapt to these climate crises that we are facing. So it is open to all the panelists. You can ask perhaps Mr. Kunal to maybe share his experiences or opinions.
Thanks, Ramendra, for the question, and thanks, Shivani, for posting that up. I think a very realistic question, to be honest. It all depends on how communities can build that resilience within their families, within their societies to adapt to climate change. I mean, definitely it could be. It could be taken in either way. If it's taken regarding to food security, having more resilient, climate resilient plants or food sources that can last you during disasters that are so common in Fiji. So that question can be addressed in a number of ways on food security, on infrastructure. I mean, climate resilient infrastructure is one of the areas that's really coming up as a research area. But also, if you're looking at a level that is related to survival of people, I think that's really important, because we need to understand that cyclones or natural disasters are becoming more intensive. If not more frequent, they're becoming more intensive. So I think the way we build our homes, to be, just a simple way to say, or how we store water. So these are very simple ways of building resilience within your families, within your communities. But also, if you look at the health side of it, right now I think Fiji is really focusing on the area of climate resilient health systems, or making a health system more accessible to people in areas which are being in which disasters are quite frequent, like flooding, areas of Ba, areas of Nandi. So I mean, if there's a lot of rain, and I think that the FEST working group report that was released late last year, I think there was for PCIDS, I think that it was said that there will be a lot of rain. So I think, how do we adapt to that, or how do we prepare ourselves better for those kind of situations? We know that there's November to April is a cyclone season in Fiji, so we need to prepare for that. So I think preparation and planning is critical for countries like Fiji. We cannot go with the mindset that things will be okay. I think business as usual is not what we are trying to stick with here. It's time for action right now. So I think action at the very basic level, I think is important, just so we can prevent that hazards or vulnerabilities of the region. But I hope I have answered that question. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Singh, for sharing your opinion. Perhaps we can hear something from Ms. Stephanie as well, in terms of some of the hands-on yet effective approaches that the communities can what you call adopt in terms of adaptation.
Thank you, moderator. Thank you, Shubhani, for the question. For us, for FMS, what we are trying to do in our organization is trying to reach out as much as possible to the communities. We have been becoming a people-oriented. We're trying to get across to the communities for them to be able to better understand the public weather bulletin that we are issuing, climate outlook, rainfall outlook. So what we're trying to do is go out to the communities and advise them on this is the projections, or this is the likely scenarios that are likely to happen in the near future. And from those information, they can decide on what are the measures that they can do. If, for example, if they intend to build the houses along the coast, closer to the sea, this information will help them plan on their day-to-day activities also. Make them try and store as much water as possible during this the wet season, and when we transition into the dry season, they still have much water stored, and try and come up with more storage capacities. Those are some of the things that the communities can decide and help them to survive in the next climate scenarios that we may come across in the near future. Hope I have answered your question. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Stephanie. Now I will
just Ramendra.
Yes.
So I think the sort of previous two panelists have raised some really important things. That climate forecasts of different types can be useful. Important that it's not just a forecast, but it comes as a package which is attached to action. So when the forecast is like this, these are the sorts of things you might want to think about doing. So it has to be a package. It's not just a forecast by itself. And of course, that has to be communicated in a way which is understandable, accessible, and appreciated by the people it's aimed at. One of the challenges with going down the very practical options, what they tend to do is they tend to be around making the existing system more robust. So it's actually strengthening your existing system or adapting your existing system. And one of the other questions in the Q&A was about more transformational options. And so sometimes more transformational options are the best thing to do. So it's not about just strengthening your existing system, but it's actually about doing something quite different. And one of those types of transformation is relocation. So where you move houses away from the coast so that they're not as affected by sea level rise and storm surge and increased waves. And oftentimes those more transformational changes need the extra support. They need governments to engage in the planning process. They need to have infrastructure put in, as well as the houses which are moving. People need to have a way of sequencing the move so that it doesn't disrupt the social networks that they have. Different people may have different abilities to pay for that move, and so that needs to be taken into account, and lots of other complexities. So I think yes, we do need to have the simple hands-on, making our existing systems stronger, but we also need to be thinking about some of those transformational changes as well.
Thanks, Prof. Howden. I was coming to that question, but you have diligently answered that. There's also one more question regarding this report. So it is from Professor Anirudh Singh. So he was asking whether we can have a similar report created for the Pacific region, just for the Pacific region only. Is there any possibility?
Within the IPCC, there are things called special reports, but they're not usually done on a regional basis. But there's no reason why an organisation like SPREC couldn't actually put out a Pacific report of its own. The challenge, I think, is that they will quickly run into the same limitations in terms of scientific literature as the IPCC ran into, and so I think there's an element of there has to be an expansion of the documentation of the reports before we can make significant additional progress through regional reports. Having said that, is that a regional report can actually provide much more the information in a much better context. So it's information which is provided into the Pacific context, taking into account the social, cultural, governance, legal sort of elements that apply in different Pacific nations. And so I'm not at all dismissing the fact there could be value in a report, but one also has to reflect on the underlying information and whether that's adequate to really make a big change over and above what's been done by the IPCC.
Thank you, Prof Howden. I think Miss Daphne was raising her hand. If you want to add something.
Sorry, I just wanted to add that after the release in 2021, CSIRO in Australia, in partnership with SPREC, managed to come up with the next gen projections just for the Western Tropical Pacific. It contains projections that have been narrowed down to for some of the Pacific Island countries. And we can provide you the link. I can send you the link. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Yes, please do share the link so we can always share it around with all the participants as well. Just one quick last question to perhaps Professor Howden. So there's a question from Federico who says, to what extent does the new report cover anticipatory action based on climate forecasts? Any comments on that, Professor?
Yeah, thanks, Federico. So the report actually has a lot of material in there in different ways on anticipatory work. So there's a big sort of element in there about anticipatory governance, about enabling conditions that support adaptation, that address limits to adaptation, address maladaptation. There's, in particular, once you start dealing with the issues to do with climate resilient development, which adds adaptation to emission reduction to sustainable development, then those issues about anticipatory governance and anticipatory action actually really apply significantly. Now, in terms of the direct question about climate forecast, that's part of the picture that the IPCC raises. And that comes back to that point that I made before, is that having a forecast is one thing, but having a forecast that is linked to action is a different thing again. And you can really only do that if you actually engage with people beforehand, so that you actually have a flood warning plan, you have a cyclone action plan that people understand before the cyclone ever hits. So that anticipatory element, the preparation, is becoming ever more important in terms of managing disaster risks. And if we look at the global scale, then there's a thing called the Sendai framework, which is the global disaster risk framework, and that's trying to move that conversation across the globe away from response and recovery to preparation. So that's part of a global move where we're sort of focusing on getting things ready before the shock, rather than cleaning up the mess after the shock.
Thank you, Prof Howden. So there are so many questions in there in the Q&A forum rather. We will take one last question and then we will wind up the session. So the last question I would take is, what are the thoughts of the panelists on how the indigenous and local knowledge can work as enablers for adaptation? Just sharing your opinions, perhaps. Would like to go first? Professor Howden?
Look, I can provide some general comments. again, in the report is that there's a significant recognition that Indigenous and local knowledge is actually really important from a point of view of adaptation. So it's taking effective responses. And one of the things that there is, publications on is how you can integrate that Indigenous and local knowledge with the sort of scientific knowledge base, the sorts of things that Arietta was talking about. And that's a work in progress. It's still finding ways of how to do that effectively. But that Indigenous and local knowledge is often really crucial in terms of getting the broad scale adaptation options down to the household level or to the community level where they are going to be implemented. And so you have the sort of broad sort of hand waving idea, but then when you actually want to implement it, the changing fishing practice will be fundamentally dependent on the understanding of those people in that community, if it's near shore fisheries, about their equipment, their responses to things like weather and tides and wave action, where they know the fish is at different times of year and what type of bait works in different times. So when you actually go down to that really fine-grained action, it's that local and Indigenous knowledge which is often really important in taking it from an idea into that action.
Thank you, absolutely, Professor Howden. Any last comments from Ms. Stephanie?
Thank you. I do agree with Professor Howden for the specific national services. That is something that we are trying to do, is to try and get additional knowledge. We've also, there's also been people, I think, on the
I think there's some issues with the internet connection of Ms. Daphne. Any last comments from Kunal?
Thanks, Raman. I think I'd agree with Professor Mark Howden on bringing that global adaptation picture into something that's really focused at the very ground level. And I think specifically on adaptation using local knowledge and Indigenous communities, I think something that we do in Fiji, and also I think most of the Pacific Island countries, is on oceans and marine protected areas. Is something that's really common, and that is used, and that's entirely the principle of marine protected areas, entirely based on regional and cultural practices that is implemented in the villages or in the community. So I think that's just one example, and there's many others that we can talk about. But I think Indigenous people and Indigenous communities play a huge role in climate adaptation, not only at the national level, at the policy level, but when you go down to the community level, it's tremendous, and I think it's something that needs to be continually pushed for in these decision-making spaces.
Thank you. Absolutely, I agree. Thank you very much to all our panelists, Mr. Kushal Raj, Mr. Kunal Singh, Ms. Arietta Daphne, and Professor Mark Howden. You have diligently answered, I think, most of the questions. And we have a lot of questions there as well. So if there are any other questions, we can direct them directly. And I think we will share the email addresses as well of our panelists. So you can always directly contact them if you have any questions. And yes, we need to have more scientific literature, as everyone has mentioned. And we need to do more research and do our findings in the Pacific as well. Thank you very much. Appreciate your effort and time. And I will now hand over to our MC, Ms. Priyatma. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Dr. Raman and the panelists. Indeed, a great session we had today. And I feel like, we need a part 2 of this session to continue the great discussions that we have been having today. I can see there's still a lot of questions in the Q&A tab, and these are all relevant to me. And I feel like, this would require another 2-hour session to just discuss the questions next time, perhaps. So, but unfortunately, we are running out of time. So I must thank our Vice Chancellor, Professor Shamim, for providing an interesting input at the beginning. Definitely, she touched upon something that is not often discussed in climate change discussions, and that is the legal aspects of climate change issues. That is something that we need to explore together. And Professor Mark Howden, thank you so much again for that interesting presentation and for providing us with some of the options for adaptations. It is now an established fact that we are all highly vulnerable to the impacts of climate change, but there are options for adaptation. And I particularly liked it when you mentioned that these changes or adaptations that we are currently undergoing must be transformational in nature. And it requires definitely a greater input from all the relevant stakeholders, and our communities in the Pacific must be at the heart of all these discussions. So we need to, I believe, organize or prepare a better way in which we can, engage our communities in the participatory exercises that we are currently organizing across the country. So this is where we as researchers come in as well. I think there was a lot of discussions on more research from the Pacific Island countries, and we hope to contribute towards the wider scientific literature so that our input is recognized in the IPCC reports as well. And thank you to all the panelists once again for your great input today. I hope we can organize similar sessions in the months ahead and have these discussions carried forward. A couple of announcements before I close up. So we provided some links to fact sheet in the chat service, and if you're interested in any of these links, I think Ms. Arietta also provided a link. We'll be able to provide it to you so you can send us an email. The session has been recorded and it will be made publicly available. We'll also be emailing a post-event survey, so would appreciate if you could take out a couple of minutes to fill this post-event survey so that when we organize the next session, we can improve it if there is a need for improvement. So with these words, I would like to thank everyone that was involved in the organization of this webinar today. Thank you so much. It has been an interesting journey, and I hope that we would be able to organize similar sessions in future with all your support. So thank you, everyone, and have a great weekend ahead.
Thank you.
Thanks very much, Priya.
Thank you. Thank you.